The mist rolled down from the Serra de Sintra that September morning in 1853, wrapping the Quinta's gardens in a shroud that seemed older than memory itself. Our engineer stood at the iron gates, his leather satchel heavy with brass instruments and rolled papers, watching how the fog transformed the estate into something from a dream, or perhaps a warning. He had seen many fountains in his 42 years, studied under the finest hydraulic masters in Paris, but something about this commission felt different. Maybe it was the way the locals had crossed themselves when he'd asked for directions at the village tavern. Maybe it was simply that everything felt different since Maria had died. The Quinta de Serra sprawled before him like a sleeping giant, its Baroque facade still bearing traces of former glory beneath the creeping ivy. Dom Afonso Carvalho had purchased it just 6 months prior, the locals whispered, for a fraction of its worth. The engineer knew better than to ask why great estates sold cheaply in Portugal these days. Some questions, he'd learned, were best left unasked, especially by a man who worked with his hands for men who worked with their inherited names. "You must be the waterman," a voice called out. The engineer turned to see a young woman descending the main steps, her movements precise despite her elaborate morning dress. Senora Isabel Carvalho appeared younger than her 35 years, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she'd rather be anywhere but hosting a tradesman. "My husband is in Lisbon on business. He said you would know what needs attending to." The engineer bowed slightly, the gesture automatic after years of navigating the space between servant and specialist. "If you could show me to the fountain, Signora." She led him through the gardens, past orange trees heavy with fruit, and hedges trimmed into geometrical patterns that spoke of better-maintained days. The morning sun was beginning to burn through the mist, revealing the estate in stages. First the immediate path, then the surrounding beds of late roses, and finally, at the garden's heart, the fountain itself. Neptune rose from the central basin, carved from a single block of local marble that had weathered to the color of old bone. The god's face bore an expression somewhere between triumph and sorrow, his trident raised toward the sky, while 4 bronze horses reared around his feet, their mouths open to release streams of water that hadn't flowed in months. The engineer circled the structure slowly, his trained eye cataloging the obvious issues: mineral deposits choking the spouts, a visible crack in the basin's eastern wall, moss growing thick where water should dance. "It's the singing that troubles us," Senora Isabel said suddenly, then caught herself. "That is, my husband finds it inconvenient for entertaining." The engineer had heard about the singing in the tavern, of course. How could he not? The locals spoke of it in hushed tones. The fountain that sang at dusk, a mournful sound that carried across the valley when the wind was still. Some said it was the ghost of the last Conde de Menezes, who died of shame after the Patuleia. Others claimed it was older, a water spirit trapped in the stone when the fountain was first built a century ago. The engineer thought it was probably a broken pipe creating resonance, but he'd learned not to dismiss local stories too quickly. Sometimes they pointed toward practical truths. "When does it sing?" he asked, running his hand along the basin's edge, feeling for vibrations in the stone. "Always at dusk, when the shadows grow long, but only on quiet evenings, when there's no wind." She paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "The servants won't come near it after 4 in the afternoon." The engineer nodded, making mental calculations. Pressure changes as the day cooled, perhaps, or something to do with the estate's water supply system, which would naturally fluctuate with household use. He'd seen stranger things, a fountain in Marseille that screamed like a banshee until he'd removed a colony of bats from the reservoir. He spent the rest of the morning mapping the visible hydraulic system, tracing the copper pipes that fed into the fountain's base, noting where they disappeared underground toward what must be the main cistern. The work was methodical, careful, the kind of task that let his mind settle into familiar patterns while his hands moved with practiced efficiency. This was what he knew, what he was good at, the logic of water, the poetry of pressure and flow. By noon, a young man appeared carrying a basket of bread and cheese. "Old Tomas sent this," the boy said, bobbing his head nervously. "He says the waterman needs to eat if he's going to understand the water." The engineer looked up from his sketches, studying the boy, perhaps 19, with intelligent eyes that darted between the engineer's instruments with obvious curiosity. "And you are?" "Miguel Silva, senor. I help with the gardens, but—" He hesitated. "I've always wanted to know how the fountains work, the real way, not the stories." There was something in the boy's manner that reminded the engineer of himself at that age, before Paris, before he understood that knowledge could be both liberation and burden. He found himself saying, "Then stay and watch, but quietly." As the afternoon wore on, the engineer became increasingly intrigued by the fountain's construction. The craftsmanship was exceptional, beyond what he'd expect for a decorative garden piece. The internal channels were precisely calibrated. The bronze fittings showed signs of careful engineering. Whoever had built this had understood hydraulics at a level that suggested formal training, possibly even genius. "My grandfather helped build it," Miguel offered quietly, having watched in silence for 2 hours. "Back when the old Conde's father was alive. He said they brought in a specialist from Italy, someone who'd worked on the Pope's fountains." The engineer filed this information away. Italian fountain makers were artists as much as engineers, known for incorporating subtle effects, hidden sprays, musical pipes, mechanical movements. Perhaps the singing wasn't a malfunction at all, but a feature whose purpose had been forgotten. As the sun began its descent toward the Atlantic, painting the mist-shrouded hills in shades of amber and rose, the engineer felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with evening. 3 years. And still the hour of sunset reminded him of Maria, of their evening walks along the Tagus, of her laughter mixing with the cries of the swallows. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the technical drawings spread before him on the fountain's edge. That's when he heard it. The sound began so softly he thought it might be wind in the trees, but there was no wind. It grew, not louder but clearer, a melody without words rising from the fountain itself. Not from the dry spouts or the empty basin, but from the very stone, as if Neptune himself were humming a lament for his dry kingdom. The engineer stood transfixed, his rational mind cataloging acoustic properties, while his heart responded to something deeper, older, sadder than mere physics could explain. Miguel had gone pale, backing away slowly. From the main house, the engineer could see Senora Isabel watching from a window, her hand pressed to her throat. And somewhere in the gardens, hidden among the geometrical hedges, he sensed other watchers, the servants who wouldn't come near, but couldn't help listening to the stone god's evening song. The engineer placed his hand on the marble, feeling the almost imperceptible vibration traveling through the stone. Whatever this was, it was no ghost, no spirit, no curse. It was something far more interesting, a mystery of engineering, wrapped in a legend, hidden in plain sight. And he had 3 weeks to solve it, or at least to make it stop singing its secret song into the Portuguese dusk. The engineer remained at the fountain until well past dark that first evening, listening to the stone Neptune's lament fade with the last light. By the time he made his way to the modest room the Carvalhos had arranged for him above the old coach house, his mind was already sorting through possibilities, discarding the impossible, focusing on the probable. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of water singing through bronze pipes, of Maria's voice mixing with hydraulic harmonies he couldn't quite decode. Morning arrived with Dom Afonso himself, his carriage clattering into the courtyard just as the engineer was preparing his tools for the day's investigation. The merchant was exactly what one would expect of new Portuguese money, well-fed without being corpulent, dressed in English wool despite the autumn warmth, carrying himself with the studied dignity of someone who'd learned to be wealthy rather than being born to it. His handshake was firm, a businessman's grip, and his eyes held the calculating look of someone who measured everything in raise and profit. "My wife tells me you heard it," Dom Afonso said without preamble. "The singing." "I heard something that requires investigation," the engineer replied carefully. In his experience, men like Dom Afonso wanted solutions, not mysteries. "With your permission, I'll need full access to the estate's water systems, including the main cistern and any underground channels." "Whatever you need." The merchant pulled out a leather purse heavy with coin. "I'm hosting the provincial governor in 3 weeks. The fountain must be working and silent by then." The engineer understood. This wasn't about superstition or servants' fears. This was about social position, about a new money merchant trying to establish himself among people who still whispered about the previous owner's disgrace. A singing fountain linked to the Menezes family's failed rebellion would be social poison. After Dom Afonso departed for his Lisbon offices, the engineer set about his methodical investigation. Miguel appeared shortly after breakfast, carrying a collection of rusted keys he'd convinced old Tomas to surrender. "He says one of these opens the cistern house," the boy explained. "But he won't say which one." They tried 17 keys before finding the right one. The cistern house squatted behind a screen of cypress trees, built from the same honey-colored stone as the main house, but without any decorative pretensions. Inside, the air was cool and damp, filled with the sound of water moving through unseen channels. The engineer lit his lantern, revealing a magnificent piece of hydraulic engineering, a vaulted chamber with a deep pool at its center, fed by ceramic pipes that emerged from the walls at various heights. "Sweet Mother of God," Miguel whispered, his voice echoing off the stone. "It's like a cathedral." The engineer had to agree. The cistern was far more elaborate than necessary for a simple garden water feature. He began sketching the visible pipe system, noting the unusual valve arrangements, the secondary channels that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. As he worked, he became aware of subtle variations in the water's sound. Sometimes a steady flow, sometimes an almost musical gurgle. "Tell me about the Menezes family," he said to Miguel, who was holding the lantern steady. "Not the stories everyone knows, the real things, how they lived." Miguel shifted uncomfortably. "My grandmother was a laundry maid here. She said the old conde was brilliant but strange, loved machines and inventions, had a workshop where the orangery is now, full of clockwork and peculiar devices. The engineer nodded, pieces beginning to form a pattern in his mind. A nobleman with mechanical interests, Italian fountain makers, elaborate hydraulics. This was no ordinary garden ornament. They spent the morning mapping the underground channels, following pipes through narrow service tunnels that hadn't seen maintenance in years. The engineer's clothes were soon soaked with condensation and cobwebs, but his excitement grew with each discovery. The system was ingenious, with pressure regulators and flow controls that would have impressed his Parisian masters. At midday, Senora Isabel found them emerging from behind the fountain, covered in mud and limestone dust. She carried a tea service on a silver tray, an incongruous sight in the working garden. "You look like you've been wrestling with the devil himself," she observed, setting the tray on a stone bench. "Only with the devils of engineering, Senora," the engineer replied, accepting the offered cup gratefully. The tea was flavored with bergamot, a luxury that spoke of Brazilian trade connections. She watched him drink, seeming to wrestle with something. Finally, she said, "I need to know, will you truly be able to stop it? The singing?" "I believe so. But first I need to understand why it sings." "Does the why matter?" Her voice carried an edge of desperation he hadn't expected. "In my experience, Senora, the why always matters. A problem poorly understood is a problem poorly solved." That afternoon, as the sun tracked toward its western descent, the engineer positioned himself differently, placing sensitive measuring instruments at key points around the fountain. Miguel helped, his natural intelligence making up for his lack of formal training. Together they created a network of observations: pressure gauges, flow meters, even simple wine glasses placed to catch vibrations. As the shadows lengthened, other members of the household began to appear, drawn by curiosity despite their fears. The cook, a formidable woman named Rosa, stood in the kitchen doorway. Two stable boys peered around the corner of the carriage house. Even old Tomas emerged from wherever he spent his days, leaning heavily on a walking stick, his eyes fixed on Neptune's marble face. The engineer checked his pocket watch, 10 minutes before the usual time. He signaled Miguel to watch the pressure gauge nearest the fountain's base. The boy crouched, tense with anticipation. Then it began. This time, the engineer was ready. He watched his instruments as the sound rose from the stone, noting how the pressure in the main feed line dropped just before the singing started, how certain pipes seemed to resonate while others remained silent. The melody was more complex than he'd initially thought. Not a single note, but a chord, harmonics building on each other in ways that suggested, "It's not random," he said aloud, his voice cutting through the supernatural fear that held the watchers frozen. "It's designed, purposeful." The singing reached its peak, a mournful beauty that seemed to pull at something deep in the chest. Then, as the last direct sunlight faded from Neptune's trident, it stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pregnant with unasked questions. Old Tomas was suddenly beside him, moving with surprising speed for his age. "You understand, don't you?" the old gardener wheezed. "It's not broken. It's working exactly as it should." The engineer met his gaze steadily. "Then perhaps you can tell me what it's supposed to do." Tomas shook his head, already backing away. "Some things are better left buried with the dead, senor. The water remembers, but we shouldn't." That night, the engineer sat in his room, surrounded by sketches and calculations. The singing was definitely mechanical. He'd identified resonance points, pressure differentials, even what might be carefully placed sound chambers. But Tomas was right. This wasn't a malfunction. Someone had deliberately designed the fountain to sing, but only under specific conditions. The precise pressure that occurred at dusk, when the household's water usage dropped and the system naturally equilibrated. He thought of the Menezes family, their connection to the failed Patulea rebellion, the estate sold cheaply to new money. What secret had they built into their fountain? What message did Neptune sing to the evening air? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Miguel stood at the door, holding an old leather journal. "My grandmother gave me this," he said quietly. "She said if anyone could understand it, it would be someone who truly knows water." The engineer took the journal carefully. It was written in a careful hand, mixing Portuguese with Italian technical terms. The first entry was dated 1812, the year the fountain was constructed. As he began to read, his breath caught. These weren't just construction notes. They were instructions for something far more elaborate, a system of acoustic engineering that would have been revolutionary for its time. Outside, a nightingale began its evening song, its natural melody mixing with the sound of water flowing through ancient pipes. The engineer read on, beginning to understand that the fountain's song was no ghost story, no curse, no accident. It was a key, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. The journal's yellowed pages revealed secrets with each careful turning. The Italian fountain maker's precise hand documenting something far beyond decorative waterworks. Our engineers sat hunched in the pale morning light, decoding technical drawings that showed Neptune not as mere statue, but as an instrument of extraordinary sophistication. Giuseppe Torelli, it seemed, had been part artisan, part engineer, and perhaps part conspirator. Miguel brought breakfast as the bells of Sintra's churches announced the 8 o'clock hour, finding the engineer surrounded by sketches he'd made through the night. "My grandmother asks if you've been bewitched by the fountain," the boy said, setting down bread and strong coffee. "She says men who stare too long at water see things that aren't there. Tell your grandmother that I'm seeing things that are very much there, just hidden." The engineer rubbed his tired eyes, then showed Miguel a particular diagram. "Look at this. 7 chambers, each one calculated to produce a different tone when water passes through at the correct pressure." The boy studied the drawing with the intensity of someone glimpsing a larger world. "Like a flute?" "More sophisticated. Flutes require breath and conscious control. This system responds to natural pressure variations. It's mechanical memory, Miguel. The fountain remembers what pressure means, what sound." They worked through the morning, using thin copper probes to map the fountain's hidden interior. The engineer marveled at the craftsmanship required to hollow out chambers within solid marble, to place bronze resonators where no one would ever see them. His respect for both Torelli and whoever commissioned this work grew with each discovery. Around midday, as clouds gathered over the Serra promising afternoon rain, old Tomas appeared. The elderly gardener moved slowly, each step deliberate, conserving energy like a man who knew his reserves were limited. He watched them work, his rheumy eyes sharp with intelligence. "You're finding the old secrets," Tomas said. It wasn't a question. The engineer straightened, his back protesting from hours of bending. "I'm finding engineering. Whether it's secret or not depends on why it was built." Tomas laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. Everything was secret in those days. The old Conde, the father, not the son who lost everything. He believed Portugal could become modern without losing its soul. He brought in foreigners with new ideas. Torelli wasn't the only one. "Tell me about the son," the engineer prompted, sensing the old man's willingness to talk. "Brilliant boy, everyone said so. Learned mathematics, natural philosophy, spoke 5 languages. But he inherited his father's dreams without understanding the price of dreaming too loudly." Tomas lowered himself onto a stone bench, his breathing labored. When the Patulea came, he chose the wrong side. Not from evil, you understand, but from believing Portugal was ready for changes it wasn't. The engineer considered this while Miguel carefully cleaned limestone deposits from one of the fountain's secondary pipes. History, he'd learned, was like water. It found its own level, regardless of human intentions. There were meetings, Tomas continued, his voice dropping. Secret gatherings of men who thought like the young Conde. They needed ways to communicate without letters that could be intercepted, without messengers who could be bribed or tortured. Understanding dawned. The fountain was a signal. 5 fountains, actually, each on estates belonging to sympathizers. When they sang at certain times, it meant different things. Safe to meet, danger, success, failure. The old man's eyes grew distant. "I was young then, just a boy, helping my father with the gardens. We pretended not to notice when carriages arrived after the fountain sang its evening song." The engineer felt the weight of this knowledge settling on him. What had seemed a charming mystery was revealing itself as historical testimony, a relic of Portugal's violent struggle between absolutists and liberals, between past and future. "But the war ended 7 years ago," Miguel said, confused. "Why does it still sing?" "Because water has no politics," the engineer replied, understanding now. "The system responds to pressure, nothing more. With the estate barely maintained, the household routines different, the conditions that trigger the singing occur by accident rather than design." That afternoon, they discovered something else. Behind the fountain, hidden beneath climbing roses that had grown wild, they found a small bronze plate with calibration marks. The engineer recognized it immediately. A pressure gauge, but designed to be read only by someone who knew what to look for. Beside each mark were tiny symbols that meant nothing to him, but might have been a code. Senora Isabel appeared as they were documenting this find, moving through the garden with the careful grace of someone always aware of being watched. "My husband returns tomorrow," she announced. "He'll expect a report on your progress. Tell him I've identified the mechanism. The solution is within reach." She studied him with those nervous, intelligent eyes. "But not the whole truth." The engineer met her gaze steadily. "The truth, Senora, is that your fountain is a masterpiece of engineering that happens to sing. What story we tell about why it sings, that's a different matter." She nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. "My husband values his reputation above all things. The governor's visit will proceed without supernatural interruptions, I assure you." After she left, the engineer returned to his examination, but his mind was elsewhere, thinking about the nature of memory and mechanism. The fountain remembered its purpose, even though its creators were dead or exiled. It sang its coded songs to no one, messages of urgency and rebellion, echoing into an indifferent dusk. Miguel helped him take precise measurements of each resonating chamber, documenting frequencies and pressures. The boy's natural aptitude for the work was evident, and the engineer found himself explaining more than necessary, teaching as he investigated. "Water always tells the truth," he told Miguel as they traced a particularly complex section of piping. "It can't lie about pressure or flow or temperature."
Men lie, but water simply is.
"Is that why you trust it more than people?" Miguel asked with the startling directness of youth. The engineer paused, his hand resting on the cold bronze of a valve. Maria had asked him something similar once, teasing him about spending more time with his fountains than with living creatures. He'd laughed then, secure in their shared life. Now, 3 years later, perhaps the boy wasn't wrong. "I trust water because it follows rules," he said finally. People are more complicated." As evening approached, they prepared to observe the fountain's song again, this time with full knowledge of its mechanism. The engineer had identified which chambers would resonate at the precise pressure that occurred at dusk. He'd even calculated that the autumn temperature, cooling the pipes and slightly contracting them, contributed to the effect. The household gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by habit and curiosity.
The engineer noticed Father Joachim among them, his black cassock making him a shadow among shadows. The priest's presence reminded him that there were layers to this mystery he hadn't yet uncovered. The singing began exactly as predicted, but knowing the mechanism didn't diminish its haunting beauty. If anything, understanding the precision required to create this effect only deepened his admiration. Torelli had been an artist of water, creating something that transcended mere function. As the last notes faded, the engineer made his decision. He could stop the singing. A simple adjustment to the pressure regulators would prevent the specific conditions from occurring. But first, he needed to understand the full scope of what he was about to silence. Tomorrow, he would seek out the other estates, trace the network of singing fountains, and piece together the complete story of the Menezes conspiracy's liquid telegraph. Father Joachim arrived at the fountain shortly after matins, his weathered face carrying the gravity of someone bearing unwelcome news. The engineer was already at work, adjusting his instruments to take more precise measurements of the water flow patterns he'd documented the previous evening. Miguel stood nearby, holding a notebook where he'd been practicing technical drawings under the engineer's guidance. "I believe we should speak privately," the priest said, his voice carrying the authority of 6 decades spent shepherding souls through Portugal's turbulent changes. The engineer set down his tools, reading something in the cleric's manner that demanded attention. They walked toward the estate's small chapel, a structure that predated the main house by at least a century, its stones worn smooth by countless hands seeking solace. "You're discovering things," Father Joachim began once they were seated in a pew beneath a modest wooden crucifix. "Old Tomas has been talking, though he thinks his words stay within the confessional. At his age, the boundaries between confession and conversation sometimes blur. I'm an engineer, Father. I discover how things work. It's my nature and my profession. Some mechanisms are better left unexplained." The priest's fingers worried at his worn rosary. "The Carvalhos are good people, generous to the church, eager to establish themselves properly in society. What would happen if it became known their estate was a nexus of conspiracy?" The engineer considered this. In his focus on the technical puzzle, he'd perhaps neglected the human implications. "The fountain's singing is already known.
Isn't explaining it as mechanical failure better than allowing supernatural rumors to persist? That depends entirely on what explanation you offer. Father Joachim leaned forward, his voice dropping. I sat with the young Conde before his exile. He confessed many things, seeking absolution before fleeing to France. The fountains were just one part of a larger network, you see. Messages, weapons, gold to finance the uprising, all of it flowing through these estates like water through pipes. A sudden chill ran through the engineer despite the morning warmth. Are you telling me to stop my investigation? I'm telling you that Portugal has bled enough. The regeneration is bringing peace, progress, railroads, and prosperity. Dom Afonso represents the new Portugal, commerce over conflict, building over destroying. The priest stood, his knees creaking audibly. Solve the mechanical problem by all means. But perhaps some mysteries are better buried with incomplete explanations. After the priest departed, the engineer found himself unsettled. He'd always believed in truth as an absolute good, like clean water or precise measurements. But Father Joachim's words reminded him that truth, like water, could erode as easily as it could cleanse. He returned to find Miguel in animated conversation with Señora Isabel, who held a book of poetry, unusual for a woman of her station to be reading openly. She closed it quickly when she saw him approach, color rising in her cheeks. Miguel was telling me about water pressure, she said, as if this explained the book. I find I have an interest in understanding how things work. The engineer noticed the book's spine bore French text. Knowledge is never wasted, Señora. She gave him a look of surprised gratitude before excusing herself. Miguel watched her go with obvious admiration. She asks so many questions, the boy said. About everything, the fountains, the mathematics, even the political newspapers Dom Afonso leaves lying about. Curiosity can be dangerous for women of her class, the engineer warned gently. More dangerous than ignorance? Miguel challenged, then caught himself. Forgive me, Señor. I spoke out of turn. You spoke like someone learning to think. Never apologize for that. They spent the afternoon investigating the estate's secondary water features, smaller fountains and decorative pools that might connect to the main system. Each discovery added to the engineer's understanding of the network's complexity. The Menezes family hadn't simply built fountains. They'd created an infrastructure of communication that turned the estate into a vast musical instrument. In what had once been the orangery, now a storage building for garden tools, they found evidence of the mechanical workshop Miguel's grandmother had mentioned. Amid rusted implements and broken pottery, the engineer discovered a chest containing brass gears, springs, and what appeared to be components for clockwork mechanisms. Look at this, Miguel breathed, holding up a detailed technical drawing. It showed not just the Quinta da Sereia, but 4 other estates, connected by dotted lines labeled with musical notes. The engineer studied the map, recognizing the hand of Giuseppe Torelli in the precise draftsmanship. Each estate was marked with a different mythological figure: Neptune here, Apollo at Quinta do Sol, Diana at Quinta da Lua, Mercury at Quinta dos Ventos, and Minerva at Quinta da Sabedoria. 5 fountains, 5 notes, capable of combining into different messages. It's like a language made of water, Miguel said wonderingly. More than that, it's proof of how desperate they were, how carefully they planned. The engineer folded the map carefully. This took years to construct, enormous expense, brilliant minds working in concert. And it failed anyway, Miguel observed quietly. Perhaps, or perhaps we don't understand what success meant to them. As afternoon gave way to evening, Dom Afonso's carriage returned from Lisbon. The merchant looked tired, older than his 58 years, wearing the exhaustion of someone fighting for position in a society that barely tolerated his presence. He summoned the engineer immediately. "The governor's secretary sent word," Dom Afonso said without preamble, pouring himself brandy with hands that trembled slightly. "There are concerns about the estate's history. Some members of the provincial government remember the Menezes family too well. They're using the fountain's singing as evidence the estate remains cursed by treason." The engineer recognized political maneuvering disguised as superstition. "I can stop the singing, Dom Afonso. A simple modification to the pressure valves will prevent the specific conditions from occurring." "How soon?" "Within 2 days, but—" The engineer hesitated, then decided on partial honesty. "The fountain is a masterwork of engineering. Silencing it permanently would be like painting over a Fra Angelico fresco." Dom Afonso's laugh was bitter. "I've painted over greater things than that to survive in this country. Do what you must." That evening, the engineer stood alone by the fountain as it began its nightly performance. Now that he understood the mechanism, he could hear the individual chambers resonating, each one adding its voice to the aquatic choir. The melody tonight seemed particularly mournful, as if the fountain knew its days of singing were numbered. Senora Isabel appeared beside him, moving so quietly he hadn't heard her approach. "My husband told me you'll silence it." "It's what I was hired to do." "Yes." She paused, seeming to gather courage. "I need to tell you something, in confidence." The engineer waited, watching Neptune's marble face flickering in the light of the rising moon. "I've been meeting someone in the garden. You may have noticed. It's not what you might think. It's a tutor. I'm learning to read properly, to write, to understand mathematics." The words tumbled out quickly, as if she'd been holding them back too long. "My husband doesn't know. He wouldn't approve." "Why tell me?" "Because you understand that knowledge matters. Because you're teaching Miguel not just about fountains, but about thinking." She wrapped her shawl tighter. "And because I wanted someone to know that when this fountain stops singing, it won't be the only secret being buried at Quinta da Serrea." The fountain's song reached its crescendo, a harmony that seemed to contain all the hope and despair of the failed Patulea, of the Menezes family's grand dreams, of Portugal's struggle to find its way between past and future. Tomorrow, the engineer would begin the work of silencing it. But tonight, he stood with Senora Isabel and listened to water, remembering how to sing revolution into the soft Portuguese night. The morning mist clung to the valley like a guilty secret, as the engineer prepared for the most delicate phase of his investigation. He'd decided to partially dismantle Neptune's trident, having determined that the primary resonance chambers were concealed within its bronze shaft. Miguel had arrived before dawn, eager to assist, carrying fresh tools wrapped in oiled cloth that he'd spent the previous evening cleaning. Working with infinite care, they removed the decorative collar at the trident's base, revealing an access port no bigger than a child's fist. The engineer inserted his narrowest probe, feeling it slide through channels that hadn't been opened in decades. Then his tool encountered something unexpected. Not the smooth bronze of the resonance chamber, but something that moved slightly at his touch. "Hold this steady," he instructed Miguel, then worked a pair of fine forceps into the opening. After several attempts, he extracted a small object that made them both stop breathing for a moment. It was a brass whistle, no larger than a man's thumb, crafted with jeweler's precision. Multiple chambers spiraled through its body, and when the engineer held it to the light, he could see tiny, adjustable vanes inside, like the mechanism of a music box, but designed for water rather than air. "Mother of God," Miguel whispered. "It's beautiful." Beautiful and purposeful. The engineer recognized the craftsmanship immediately. This was Torelli's work, signed with the same precision that marked all his designs. But this whistle wasn't part of the original plans in the journal. This was something added, something secret even from the fountain's primary mechanism. They found 6 more whistles throughout the morning, each one hidden in a different location within the fountain's structure. Each whistle was unique, designed to produce different combinations of tones depending on water pressure and temperature. Together, they transformed the fountain from a simple signaling device into something far more sophisticated, an instrument capable of playing actual coded messages. "It's like finding an organ inside a flute," the engineer explained to Miguel, who was sketching each whistle with growing expertise. The main chambers produce the bass notes, but these whistles add harmonics, variations, specific phrases. Old Tomas shuffled into view around noon, his gait more labored than usual. He took one look at the brass whistles arranged on the engineer's work cloth and sank onto a nearby bench, his face pale. "So, you found them," he said heavily. "I wondered if you would. You knew about these? I helped install them." The old gardener's voice carried decades of buried weight. "The summer of 1846, just before the Patulea began. The young Conde had me and 2 others, both dead now, work at night in secret. Even the Italian didn't know. The engineer sat beside him, patient as water wearing down stone. Tell me, the original fountains were meant for simple signals, yes, no, danger, safety. But as the political situation grew worse, they needed more. The young Conde was brilliant with languages, codes. He designed these himself, spent a fortune having them made in Paris." Tomas coughed, specks of blood appearing on his handkerchief. "Each combination of whistles could spell out letters, words, not just signals but actual messages." "A hydraulic telegraph," the engineer breathed, astounded by the audacity of it. "We tested it for months. On quiet nights, you could hear the messages carrying across the valley. The rebels would gather at predetermined times, listen to the fountain sing its instructions, then disperse." The old man's eyes grew distant. "It worked perfectly until it didn't. Until someone betrayed them." Miguel had stopped sketching, absorbed in the story. "Who? Does it matter now? The young Conde fled to France. His allies were shot or imprisoned. The estate was confiscated. The fountains kept singing their messages to no one, like ghosts calling to their dead masters." The engineer examined the whistles again with new understanding. Each one showed signs of careful maintenance. Someone had been cleaning and adjusting them, keeping them functional years after their purpose had ended. "You've been maintaining them," he said to Tomas. The old gardener nodded slowly. "It seemed wrong to let such cleverness rust away. And perhaps I thought someday someone would come who could understand what they built here. Someone who could appreciate the genius of it,
before it was lost forever. Senora Isabel appeared in the garden, accompanied by a thin man in scholarly clothes, whom the engineer recognized as the local schoolmaster, undoubtedly her secret tutor. She saw the brass whistles and stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her throat. "We should speak inside," she said quickly, glancing around as if the garden itself might be listening. In the estate's library, with its leather-bound volumes and portraits of Dom Afonso's merchant predecessors, Senora Isabel surprised them all by producing a small notebook from her sleeve. "I have been documenting the fountain's songs," she admitted. "Every evening for the past 3 months, writing down the patterns, the variations." She opened the notebook, revealing pages of carefully notation. "I thought it was random at first, but there are repetitions, sequences." The engineer studied her notations, comparing them mentally to the whistle configurations. "You've been recording messages, old messages, playing over and over because no one reset the mechanism." "What do they say?" she asked urgently. Working together with the engineer's knowledge of the mechanism, Senora Isabel's records and Tomas's memory of the code system, they began to decipher the fountain's repeated message. It took an hour of cross-referencing and debate, but finally the meaning emerged. Meeting compromised. Scatter. Await new moon signal. God preserve Portugal. The room fell silent. Here was the last message of the failed rebellion, playing nightly to an empty garden for 7 years. The engineer felt the weight of history, of failed dreams dissolved into water and bronze. "It's rather sad," Senora Isabel said softly. "All that hope, ending in an endless warning no one heeds." Dom Afonso entered without warning, his face flushed with wine and worry. "The governor's advance party arrives tomorrow to inspect the property. The fountain must be silent by then." The engineer stood, decision crystallizing. "It will be, Dom Afonso, but I'll need to work through the night. Do whatever is necessary. I don't care if you have to tear Neptune from his pedestal." After the merchant stormed out, the engineer turned to the others. "I can silence it without destroying it. The whistles can be removed, the resonance chambers plugged. The fountain will still flow, still be beautiful, but it will never sing again." "Is that what you want to do?" Miguel asked, and the engineer heard echoes of his younger self in the boy's reluctance to destroy something remarkable. "What I want is irrelevant. I was hired to solve a problem." He began gathering the whistles, each one a small masterpiece that would soon be nothing more than brass curiosities in some drawer. "But we'll document everything first, every measurement, every note of the code. If this knowledge is to be buried, at least it will be properly recorded." They worked through the afternoon, creating detailed drawings and descriptions. Senora Isabel proved invaluable, her quick mind grasping technical concepts with surprising ease. The schoolmaster contributed his knowledge of linguistics, helping to fully decode the whistle language. Even Tomas, despite his failing health, provided crucial details about installation and maintenance. As evening approached, they prepared for the fountain's final performance. Word had somehow spread through the household, and servants gathered in the garden, understanding that they were witnessing an ending. The engineer had arranged his tools for the night's work, but for now, he stood with the others, waiting. The fountain began its song exactly on schedule, but now they could hear it differently, not as a ghost's lament, but as a machine faithfully executing its last duty. The engineer could identify each whistle's contribution, each chamber's resonance, the entire aquatic orchestra performing its swan song. When the last note faded,
He stepped forward, tools in hand. Time to let the old secrets rest. But as he reached for the first whistle, his hand hesitated. These small brass miracles had outlasted their creators, their cause, their entire world. Tomorrow they would be silent metal. Tonight, for one last time, they had sung their coded warning to the Portuguese dusk, faithful to the end. The engineer worked through the night, but not in the way Dom Afonso expected. Instead of immediately silencing the fountain, he carefully removed each whistle, documenting its position, measuring its precise dimensions, recording every detail that might otherwise be lost. Miguel stayed with him, holding lanterns, taking notes, learning that sometimes preservation of knowledge matters more than immediate solutions. By dawn, they had removed all 7 whistles and created a complete schematic of the fountain's secret mechanism. The engineer wrapped each whistle in soft cloth, placing them in a wooden box he'd found in the old workshop. These pieces of history deserved better than being melted down for their brass. "Shouldn't we destroy them?" Miguel asked, exhausted but still curious. "If anyone finds out what they were, history isn't erased by destroying artifacts," the engineer replied, sealing the box with wax. "It's erased by forgetting why they mattered." Father Joachim arrived as the morning bells rang, finding them still at the fountain. He took in their exhausted faces, the carefully sealed box, the fountain standing silent in the dawn light. "It's done then?" "The singing is stopped. The mechanism is disabled, but not destroyed." The engineer met the priest's eye steadily. "The fountain will function as intended, as a beautiful water feature. Nothing more." The priest nodded slowly. "And the knowledge you've gained will remain with those who already know. The dead keep their secrets, Father." As the priest departed, Señora Isabel emerged from the house, carrying coffee and sweetbread. She'd clearly not slept either, her notebook visible in her pocket. "My husband is still abed," she said quietly. The wine helped him forget his worries temporarily. They sat by the silent fountain, eating in companionable exhaustion. The engineer noticed how different Neptune looked without his voice, still magnificent, but somehow diminished, like a great singer forced into permanent silence. "I've been thinking about the Menezes family," Señora Isabel said suddenly, "about how they built all this brilliance into stone and water, believing Portugal would change. They were wrong about the timing, but perhaps not about the direction." Old Tomás joined them, moving even more slowly than usual. He looked at the silent fountain with an expression of profound sadness. "50 years I've been here," he said, "through 3 families, 2 wars, countless seasons. This fountain has been my clock, my calendar, my constant companion." "It will still flow," the engineer assured him. "A man without a voice still breathes, but is he still the same man?" Tomás shook his head. "But you did what was necessary. The living matter more than the dead." The morning progressed with preparations for the governor's inspection. Dom Afonso emerged, anxious and demanding to see the fountain operate. The engineer activated the water flow, and Neptune's horses sprayed perfect arcs of crystal water, the god's presence commanding but mute. Dom Afonso circled it several times, listening intently for any hint of sound beyond the splash of water. "Excellent," he declared, relief visible in his shoulders. "You've earned your fee twice over." But as the engineer watched the merchant hurry away to prepare for his important guests, he felt the weight of what had been lost. The fountain was beautiful, functional, but its genius had been amputated. He thought of the young Conde in exile, probably in some Parisian apartment, possibly hearing of his fountain's silence, and understanding that the last echo of his rebellion had finally been stilled. Miguel spent the day helping with final adjustments, ensuring the water pressure was perfectly balanced, the flow rates optimal. The boy had learned so much in these few days, not just about hydraulics, but about the complexities of history, the price of progress, the weight of secrets. "Will you take me as a proper apprentice?" Miguel asked suddenly as they worked. "I want to learn everything, not just fountains, but engineering, mathematics, perhaps even go to Paris like you did." The engineer considered this. He'd been alone since Maria's death, throwing himself into work to avoid the empty spaces in his life. Taking an apprentice meant responsibility, connection, a future beyond the next commission. "It's hard work," he warned. "Years of study, little glory, serving men who often don't understand what you do. But you understand. You make water dance, make stones sing." Miguel's eyes shone with possibility. "Even if we had to silence this fountain, you understood its song." That afternoon, Tomas asked to speak with the engineer privately. They walked slowly to the old gardener's cottage, a simple structure covered in climbing roses. Inside it was neat but sparse, the home of a man who'd given his life to tending others' gardens. From beneath his narrow bed, Tomas pulled a leather satchel, his movements careful and pained. "I won't last another winter," he said matter-of-factly. "The consumption has reached my bones. Before I die, someone should know the complete truth." He opened the satchel, revealing letters, documents, and a small portrait of a young nobleman with intelligent, desperate eyes, the young Conde de Menezes. "He wrote to me from Paris," Tomas admitted. "Not often, but enough. He never stopped believing Portugal would change, that his sacrifice meant something." He pulled out a particular letter, dated just months ago. "He knows about Dom Afonso buying the estate. He's glad it went to new money, to builders rather than old aristocracy. He says the future belongs to men who work, not those who inherit." The engineer read the letter, written in educated but shaking hand. The exiled Conde was ill, probably dying, but his words carried no bitterness, only a kind of tired hope for a Portugal he'd never see again. "He asks about the fountain," Tomas continued, "whether it still sings. I haven't had the heart to write back about your work." "Then don't. Tell him it sings occasionally when the wind is right. Let him die thinking some part of his dream survives." Tomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "You understand more than just water, engineer." As evening approached, the first evening without the fountain's song, the estate felt different, expectant but somehow relieved. The governor's party was scheduled to arrive the next morning, and Dom Afonso bustled about with final preparations, his anxiety palpable. Senora Isabel found the engineer making final notes in his journal. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "not just for solving the fountain, but for how you solved it, with respect for what it was. Knowledge deserves respect, regardless of its source." She pulled out her notebook, showing him pages of new writing, not the fountain's code, but mathematical equations, engineering principles she'd been studying. "The schoolmaster says I have aptitude, that if I were a man I could study at university." "Portugal will change," the engineer said, thinking of the exiled Conde's letters. "Perhaps not in our lifetime, but change comes like water, slowly, persistently, inevitably."
That night, the engineer stood by the silent fountain one last time. Neptune's marble face seemed peaceful in the moonlight, freed from his burden of secret songs. The water flowed steadily, creating its own simple music of splashes and streams, honest sounds without hidden meaning. Miguel appeared beside him, as the engineer had somehow expected. They stood together, master and unofficial apprentice, watching water follow its eternal laws. "Do you regret silencing it?" the boy asked. The engineer considered this. "I regret that it needed silencing. But some machines outlive their purpose, and forcing them to continue becomes cruelty." He thought of Maria, of how he'd wanted to keep her alive beyond what was kind or possible, how letting go had been the hardest kind of love. The fountain served its purpose.
Now it can rest. Somewhere in Paris, an old revolutionary dreamed of Portuguese fountains singing freedom into the night. Here in Sintra, water flowed silently through bronze and stone, carrying no messages except the eternal truth of gravity and pressure. The engineer had done his job, preserved what knowledge he could, and given an old secret a dignified death. Tomorrow the governor would see nothing but a beautiful fountain. Tonight, those who knew the truth stood vigil over its silence. The governor's inspection passed without incident, the fountain performing its aquatic display perfectly while maintaining its newfound silence. Dom Afonso's relief was so palpable that he pressed an extra purse of silver into the engineer's hands, which the engineer quietly passed to Miguel later, telling him to begin saving for his education. 2 days after the governor's departure, old Tomas collapsed in the garden. The engineer found him beside a bed of autumn roses, his breathing shallow and labored, blood specking his lips. Together with Miguel, they carried the old gardener to his cottage, where Señora Isabel was already summoning the doctor, despite knowing what he would say. The consumption had reached its final stage. "I need to tell you something," Tomas wheezed, gripping the engineer's wrist with surprising strength. "About the other fountains. About what really happened." The engineer pulled a chair close to the narrow bed, while Miguel prepared willow bark tea to ease the old man's pain. Outside, rain began to fall, the first real storm of autumn drumming against the cottage's thin windows. "There were 5 fountains, yes," Tomas began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But also 5 men who maintained them, who knew the complete system. I was the youngest." He paused, gathering strength. "The others are all dead now. João at Quinta do Sol, shot by royalists. Pedro at Quinta de Lua died in prison. The others, time took them. The fountains still exist, changed, modified, but yes. After the rebellion failed, each estate was sold. The new owners did what new owners do, tried to erase the past. But you can't entirely erase something built into stone and water." Tomas coughed, more blood appearing. "I visited them over the years, secretly. 3 still sing occasionally. 1 was destroyed completely. The last holds the real secret." Señora Isabel entered with the doctor, a thin man who took one look at Tomas and shook his head minutely. He administered laudanum for the pain but offered no false hope. As the drug took effect, Tomas seemed to drift between past and present, his eyes seeing things beyond the cottage walls. "The young Conde was cleverer than anyone knew," he mumbled. "The fountains weren't just for sending messages. They were repositories. Each one held something essential." His eyes focused suddenly on the engineer. "In Neptune's base, beneath the main valve chamber. Did you look there? The engineer admitted he hadn't fully explored that area, focusing instead on the singing mechanism. Tomas gripped his hand urgently. "Go, look. Before I die, someone should know." Despite the rain, the engineer and Miguel made their way to the fountain. Using the drainage protocols the engineer had established, they emptied the main basin, exposing the base structure. There, beneath a carefully fitted stone that appeared to be part of the foundation, they found a sealed bronze cylinder. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were documents that made the engineer's hands tremble. Not just plans for the fountains, but correspondence between liberal leaders across Europe, lists of sympathizers, financial records of support from unexpected sources, including several prominent merchants who now served in the government. At the bottom lay a sealed letter addressed to future Portugal. They brought everything back to Tomas's cottage, where the old man was struggling against the laudanum's pull toward unconsciousness. When he saw the bronze cylinder, tears ran down his weathered cheeks. "Read the letter," he whispered. "The young Conde wrote it the night before he fled. He wanted someone to understand, not just what they did, but why." The engineer broke the seal carefully, reading aloud in the dim light. "To whomever finds this, we built these fountains as monuments to hope. Not the hope that we would succeed. By the time this is hidden, we will likely have failed. But hope that Portugal will continue to seek its own path toward justice and prosperity. We were not traitors, but patriots who loved our country too much to watch it stagnate. The water that flows through these stones carries our dreams forward. May you live in the Portugal we could only imagine." The room fell silent except for Tomas's labored breathing and the rain against the windows. Señora Isabel wept quietly, whether for the old gardener or the young Conde or Portugal itself, the engineer couldn't say. "There's more," Tomas said, rallying slightly. "Each fountain hid something different. Military plans at Apollo, financial records at Diana, letters at Mercury and at Minerva." He paused, his breath rattling. "At Minerva they hid the gold. Emergency funds for families of those who were caught. It was never claimed." Father Joachim arrived to perform last rites, but Tomas waved him away initially. "First the living, then the dying." He turned to Miguel. "Boy, you have good hands and a better mind. Learn from this man. Become what Portugal needs, not a revolutionary or a reactionary, but a builder. To Señora Isabel, your secret is safe with me to the grave, but stop hiding." Intelligence in women isn't a sin, whatever your husband fears. The young Conde's own sister was the smartest of us all. She designed the cipher system. To the engineer, "You understand water and stone, but remember they serve people. Every fountain you build, every system you design, ask yourself, does this make life better for those who'll use it long after the builders are forgotten?" Finally, he accepted Father Joachim's ministrations, confessing in Latin phrases mixed with Portuguese rambling. The engineer and the others stepped outside, standing under the cottage's narrow eaves as rain washed the world clean. "What will you do with the documents?" Señora Isabel asked. The engineer considered. The papers were historically valuable, but politically dangerous. The financial records alone could destroy several prominent families who'd successfully hidden their revolutionary connections. "What would you do?" "I'd study them thoroughly, then burn everything except the Conde's letter." Let the dead keep their secrets, but preserve their hopes. It was, the engineer thought, the wisest solution he'd heard. Tomas died just before dawn, as the rain ceased and the first birds began their morning songs. He went quietly, his last words barely audible. "Tell the Conde the fountains still remember." They buried him in the estate's small cemetery beneath an old cork oak that had probably stood there when the first stones of Quinta da Serrea were laid. Dom Afonso, to his credit, paid for a proper stone marker and allowed the household to attend. Even he seemed moved by the loss of the old gardener, who'd been as much a part of the estate as its walls and water. That evening, the engineer and Miguel worked to reseal the hiding place in Neptune's base. But first, the engineer made careful copies of certain technical drawings. Not the political documents, but the engineering innovations, the acoustic principles, the mathematical elegance of the fountain network. This knowledge was politically neutral and too valuable to lose. "Should we check the other fountains?" Miguel asked as they worked. "Find what they're hiding?" "No, we've disturbed enough graves already. Let the other secrets sleep." As they finished their work, the fountain stood silent in the gathering dusk, its usual singing time passing without a sound. The engineer found himself missing the haunting melody, that nightly reminder that even failed dreams could achieve a kind of beauty. Senora Isabel joined them, carrying 3 glasses of wine, good wine, from the estate's old cellars. "To Tomas," she said, raising her glass, "who kept faith with shadows and secrets." They drank in silence, 3 unlikely conspirators united by knowledge they'd never fully share. The fountain gurgled softly, its water following eternal patterns, carrying neither messages nor songs, but simply being what it was, stone and water and bronze, beautiful in its purposeless flow. "Will you stay longer?" Senora Isabel asked the engineer. "There's other work on the estate, and Miguel needs proper training." The engineer looked at the boy, eager and intelligent, then at the woman brave enough to educate herself despite society's restrictions, then at the fountain that had taught him about the weight of history and the price of silence. "A few more weeks," he agreed. "There's still much to do." The engineer's decision to stay proved fortuitous when Miguel made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew about the fountain network. While cleaning Tomas's cottage with Senora Isabel, the boy found a hidden compartment beneath loose floorboards, containing detailed maps of all 5 estates and their water systems, annotated in the old gardener's careful hand. "Look at this," Miguel breathed, spreading the papers on the cottage's rough table. He marked the times when each fountain sang, tracked patterns over years. The engineer studied the documents with growing amazement. Tomas hadn't just maintained Quinta da Serea's fountain, he'd been monitoring the entire network, documenting how the systems degraded, which ones still functioned, and most remarkably, occasions when the fountains had sung in harmony despite being miles apart. "These dates," Senora Isabel noted, running her finger along a column of entries, "they correspond to significant events. The Queen's coronation, the opening of the railroad to Sintra, the death of the old Conde de Menezes in Paris." It defied explanation. How could fountains, separated by valleys and hills, coordinate their songs without human intervention? The engineer's rational mind rejected coincidence, but the evidence was meticulously documented in Tomas's precise script. Dom Afonso, surprisingly, became interested when informed of the discovery. His merchant's mind saw opportunity where others might see only mystery. "If we could understand this network, control it properly, imagine the prestige, not as revolutionary tools, but as marvels of engineering,
tourist attractions for the wealthy Europeans who come to take the waters at Sintra. The engineer wanted to dismiss this as commercial vulgarity, but something in the idea appealed to him. Perhaps the fountains could find new purpose, their genius celebrated rather than hidden. Over the following days, they conducted experiments. Using the detailed maps, the engineer calculated the acoustic properties of the valley, the way sound would carry under different atmospheric conditions. Miguel proved invaluable, his young legs carrying messages between observation points while the engineer tested water pressures and flow rates. What they discovered challenged the engineer's understanding of hydraulic systems. The fountains weren't just connected by their original purpose. They were linked by underground water sources, ancient aquifers that created subtle pressure relationships between the estates. When conditions were right, a pressure change in one system could trigger responses in others, like sympathetic vibrations in tuning forks. "It's not supernatural," the engineer explained to a fascinated Senora Isabel, "but it's far more sophisticated than anything I've encountered." Torelli and the Menezes engineers didn't just build 5 fountains. They discovered and exploited a natural hydraulic network that already existed. Father Joachim visited during these investigations, watching with wary interest. "You're playing with forces beyond your understanding," he warned, though his tone suggested curiosity rather than condemnation. "All engineering involves forces beyond complete understanding," the engineer replied. "We know gravity works without knowing why. We use water pressure without fully grasping the deepest physics of fluids. Understanding enough to work with nature, that's the engineer's art." The priest considered this, then surprised them by producing his own contribution, a journal kept by his predecessor during the Patalea period, documenting strange phenomena reported by parishioners. Fountains singing in harmony, wells running backward, springs appearing where none had been before. "The people thought it was divine judgment," Father Joachim said, "but perhaps it was just water seeking its level through channels we couldn't see." As their understanding grew, so did the ethical complexity of their discovery. The engineer realized they could restore the fountain network not for revolutionary messages, but as a unique historical and engineering monument. But doing so would require cooperation from all 5 estates' current owners, disclosure of the past, and careful management of political sensitivities. Miguel, showing initiative beyond his years, had been discreetly investigating the other estates. He reported that Quinta de Sal's fountain had been partially demolished, but its underground systems remained intact. Quinta de Lua's new owner, an elderly widow, actually missed the fountain's singing and would welcome its restoration. Quinta dos Ventos belonged to the government now, used as a customs house. And Quinta de Sabiduria, Minerva's estate, had been purchased by an English businessman who found Portugal's history quaint and collectible. "We could approach them carefully," Senora Isabel suggested, "presented as historical preservation, engineering heritage. Portugal is trying to appear modern and cultured to European visitors. This could help." D'Amafonso, warming to the commercial possibilities, offered to make discreet inquiries through his business connections. The engineer found himself appointed as unofficial technical advisor to what was becoming an unexpectedly complex project. One evening, as they worked on plans for presenting their proposal, the silent Neptune fountain suddenly produced a single, clear note. Everyone froze. The engineer rushed to check his instruments. There had been no significant pressure change, no obvious trigger.
Then Miguel pointed to the horizon, where another estate was barely visible in the fading light. A thin column of smoke rose from what must be Quinta de Lua. "Signal fires," the boy said wonderingly. The old widow mentioned her husband used to light fires at sunset sometimes. Said it was for the old days. The engineer quickly calculated. The smoke would create a thermal column affecting air pressure, which in turn could influence the water table's delicate equilibrium. It was far-fetched, barely possible, but the fountain's single note suggested otherwise. "The network wants to sing again," Senora Isabel said softly. Dom Afonso surprisingly agreed. "Then we should let it, but properly, legally, without revolutionary associations." He turned to the engineer. "Can you design a system that preserves the engineering marvel while ensuring it can't be used for its original purpose?" It was a challenge worthy of his skills. Preserve the genius while preventing misuse. The engineer began sketching modifications, ways to celebrate the acoustic achievements while rendering any coded communication impossible. Miguel watched eagerly, learning how engineering served not just function, but society's complex needs. As night fell, they stood together in the garden, merchant and wife, engineer and apprentice, priest joining them with his complicated faith. The fountain remained silent except for water's natural voice, but somehow its presence felt different, expectant rather than suppressed. "Tomas would have loved this," Miguel said quietly. Seeing the fountains reborn for a new purpose, the engineer thought of the old gardener's dying words, his devotion to preserving what others would have destroyed or forgotten. Perhaps this was the ultimate vindication, not of the failed rebellion, but of the human desire to create something beautiful and lasting, even in the face of certain defeat. Senora Isabel pulled out her notebook, where she'd been working on a proposal document. Her writing had improved remarkably, showing the formal education she'd been secretly pursuing. "We'll need to present this carefully, emphasize the engineering innovation, the tourist potential, the historical significance, without the political associations. Make Portugal's past serve its future," Dom Afonso added. The merchant in him always seeking profit from any situation. Father Joachim offered his own perspective. Perhaps God works through water and stone as much as through Scripture.
These fountains sang rebellion once, but they could sing reconciliation now. The engineer listened to their various motivations, commercial, intellectual, spiritual, and realized this was how history actually worked. Not through grand gestures or pure intentions, but through the messy compromise of different people finding common ground in unexpected places. Tomorrow, they would begin the delicate process of approaching the other estate owners, of navigating the complex currents of Portuguese society with its fear of the past and hunger for the future. It would require all his engineering skills and diplomatic talents he didn't know he possessed. The meeting took place at Quinta de Lua, the elderly widow's estate, where Diana's fountain stood dry but intact. Senora Henriqueta proved to be a sharp-minded woman of 73 years who received them in a salon filled with portraits of stern ancestors and the smell of lavender and old paper. Her fountain, she explained, had sung until 5 years ago, when a well-meaning engineer had fixed it without understanding what he was destroying. My late husband knew the truth, of course, she said, pouring tea with hands that barely trembled. His elder brother died in the Patuleia, shot at Evora. We never spoke of it, but sometimes I'd catch him standing by the fountain at dusk, listening to its song with tears on his cheeks. The English businessman from Quinta de Sabadoria arrived late, bustling in with the energy of someone who measured time in money. James Morrison was everything the Portuguese aristocracy disdained: loud, direct, and utterly unimpressed by old names and older traditions. Yet his enthusiasm for the fountain network was genuine. "Remarkable engineering," he exclaimed, after the engineer explained the technical aspects. "Like the hydraulic telegraphs they're experimenting with in London, but decades earlier." This could put Sintra on the map for more than just its palace. The government representative, a cautious bureaucrat named Santos, proved more difficult. He feared any association with the Patuleia could embarrass the administration. The engineer watched as Dom Afonso worked his merchant magic, speaking of tourism revenue, international prestige, Portugal taking its place among modern nations that celebrated their history rather than hiding it. "We present it as a triumph of Portuguese engineering," Dom Afonso suggested. "Focus on the technical innovation, the artistic achievement. The political context becomes merely historical background." It was, the engineer recognized, a necessary lie. Or perhaps not a lie, but a selective truth, emphasizing one aspect while minimizing another. He thought of the documents hidden in Neptune's base, the secrets they'd already chosen to bury. History, he was learning, was as much about what was forgotten as what was remembered. Senora Isabel, who'd officially joined the meeting as her husband's secretary, a fiction everyone politely accepted, presented her research on similar hydraulic systems across Europe. The Vatican has musical fountains, Versailles has its grand waterworks, but nowhere else achieved this level of coordination across multiple sites. It's uniquely Portuguese. The engineer then unveiled his technical proposal. Each fountain would be restored to working order, but with crucial modifications. The whistles would be replaced with new ones that could produce beautiful harmonies, but couldn't form the coded messages. The pressure systems would be regulated to prevent the specific conditions that triggered the original signals. The fountains would sing again, but their revolutionary voice would be forever altered. "Like a wolf become a dog," Senora Enriqueta observed with subtle irony, "domesticated for our comfort." "Or like swords beaten into plowshares," Father Joachim countered gently. He'd accompanied them to provide moral authority, and his presence had clearly influenced Santos's receptiveness. Morrison was already calculating costs and revenues. "I'll fund my fountain's restoration entirely," he declared. "Good investment. Property values will triple once word gets out about this engineering marvel." The discussion continued through lunch, a careful dance of interests and compromises. The engineer found himself acting as translator between different worlds, explaining technical possibilities to the bureaucrat, historical significance to the businessman, financial benefits to the widow who cared more about preserving her husband's memory than any monetary gain. Miguel, who'd been permitted to attend as the engineer's assistant, took detailed notes but also watched the human dynamics with sharp eyes. Later, he would tell the engineer that this meeting taught him more about engineering's real challenges than any technical manual could. By afternoon, they'd reached an agreement in principle. The fountain network would be restored as a historical monument to Portuguese engineering. The government would provide partial funding and official recognition. Each owner would maintain control of their individual fountain,
but agreed to coordinate for special occasions when all five would sing in harmony. "There's one more thing," Senora Enriqueta said as the meeting concluded. "The gold Tomas mentioned, hidden at Minerva's fountain. What becomes of that?" Morrison looked blank. This was news to him. Santos went pale. Dom Afonso's merchant instincts visibly sharpened. The engineer realized this was the test of their fragile alliance. "If it exists," he said carefully, "it was meant for families who suffered in the Patuleia. Many of their descendants still live in poverty. Perhaps it could be discreetly distributed through the church's charity programs?" Father Joaquim nodded approvingly. Santos relaxed slightly. Church charity was politically neutral. Morrison shrugged. It wasn't his gold anyway. Senora Enriqueta smiled for the first time. "Old Tomas would have approved," she said. "He always insisted the fountains were about helping people, not politics." That evening, back at Quinta de Saraya, the engineer stood with Miguel at Neptune's fountain, testing new whistle designs. They'd created prototypes that produced hauntingly beautiful sounds, without the capacity for coded communication. The fountain could sing again, but its song would be purely aesthetic. "Is it wrong?" Miguel asked suddenly, changing their purpose, hiding their real history. The engineer considered his apprentice's question seriously. Every generation reshapes the past to serve its present needs. The Menezes family built these fountains to coordinate rebellion. We're rebuilding them to celebrate peace and prosperity. Our great-grandchildren will probably find another purpose we can't imagine. Senora Isabel joined them, carrying her notebook filled with acoustic calculations. She'd been working with remarkable dedication, her natural intelligence finally given outlet. "I've been thinking about the lie we're telling," she said, "that these fountains were merely artistic achievements rather than revolutionary tools." "You think we're wrong?" the engineer asked. "No. I think we're doing what the living must always do with the dead's dreams. Transform them into something useful for our own time." She looked at Neptune's marble face, eternally frozen between triumph and sorrow. The young Conde wanted Portugal to change. It has, just not in the way he expected. These fountains, singing for tourists and engineers rather than revolutionaries, perhaps that's its own kind of victory. Dom Afonso appeared with a bottle of aged wine, celebrating the day's successful negotiations. As he poured, the engineer noticed how the merchant had evolved during these weeks, his pure commercial instincts tempered by genuine appreciation for the engineering marvel they were preserving. "To Tomas," Dom Afonso proposed, raising his glass, "who kept the secret long enough for it to transform into something new." They drank, and then the engineer made his own toast. "To water's memory, may it remember only what helps us build better." As night fell, they tested the new whistles. The fountain sang, not the coded lament of failed rebellion, but a simpler melody, beautiful in its purposelessness. The sound carried across the valley, and in the distance, they could see a light at Quinta de Lua, where Senora Enriqueta was presumably listening. "It's different," Miguel observed. "Beautiful, but smaller somehow." "Most things become smaller when we fully understand them," the engineer replied. "Mystery gives way to mechanism." "But mechanism, properly appreciated, has its own beauty." The new song finished, leaving them in companionable silence. Tomorrow would bring contracts and construction, the practical work of restoration. But tonight, they stood together, engineer and apprentice, senora and merchant, their unlikely alliance forged by water and secrets and the necessity of living with history's weight. The engineer thought of the young Conde in Parisian exile, probably dead by now, his dreams dissolved into fountain spray and evening mist. Would he approve of this transformation? Perhaps not. But the dead don't get to vote on how the living use their legacies. The fountains would sing again, even if their song had been sanitized for a new Portugal that preferred prosperity to passion. 3 months had passed since the fountains began their new lives. The engineer stood at the rail of the Porto-bound coach, watching Sintra's hills fade into morning mist. His work was complete. All 5 fountains sang again, their voices harmonizing across the valleys on special occasions, drawing visitors from Lisbon and beyond. The Revolution's secret language had become tourist attraction, which was perhaps the strangest transformation of all. Miguel stood beside him at the coach station, no longer the uncertain garden boy, but a proper apprentice with his own leather satchel of tools and notebooks filled with hydraulic calculations. The youth would remain at Quinta da Soreia for another month, overseeing the fountain's maintenance under Senora Isabel's supervision, an arrangement that raised eyebrows, but that Dom Afonso had approved, recognizing his wife's unexpected competence in technical matters. "Remember what water teaches us," the engineer told his apprentice. "It always finds its level, always seeks the easiest path, yet, given time, it can carve through the hardest stone." "Like truth," Miguel replied, showing he'd absorbed more than just technical knowledge these past months. The engineer smiled, thinking of all the truths they'd buried and transformed. The gold from Minerva's fountain had indeed existed, almost 2,000 silver rays hidden in lead pipes beneath the statue's base. Father Joachim had discreetly distributed it to families still suffering from their grandfather's political choices, telling them it was an anonymous benefactor's charity. Morrison never knew what lay beneath his feet, and everyone agreed that was for the best. Senora Enriqueta had become the unofficial historian of the Fountain Network, collecting stories and documents with the dedication of someone preserving more than just memory. She'd even received a letter from Paris, unsigned, but in handwriting the engineer recognized from the documents in Neptune's base. The exiled Conde still lived, somehow, and had heard of the fountain's restoration. His letter contained just one line: "Let them sing of better dreams than ours." Dom Afonso had prospered from the entire affair, as merchants do. The fountain concerts, for that's what they'd become, drew wealthy visitors who spent freely at Sintra's hotels and shops. He'd been invited to join the Provincial Chamber of Commerce and spoke now of running for municipal office. The former revolutionary infrastructure had become the foundation of his thoroughly conventional success. "You'll write, won't you?" Senora Isabel asked, arriving at the coach station with a small package. "Miguel needs guidance, and I would appreciate correspondence about engineering matters." The engineer accepted the package, likely books, knowing her. Their friendship had become one of the unexpected gifts of this commission, a meeting of minds across social boundaries that would continue through letters, if not in person. "I've been thinking about water's memory," she continued, speaking quickly as the coach driver called for boarding. "How it remembers the shapes of its containers even after it's poured out. Perhaps that's what we've done here, poured the old purposes into new containers, but something of the original shape remains. It was, the engineer thought, as good a summary of their work as any. They'd taken revolutionary fountains and made them safe for a conservative present. But something of their original spirit persisted in the water's flow, in the bronze chamber's resonance, in the way the sound still made people stop and listen with wonder. Father Joachim arrived just as the engineer was boarding, slightly out of breath from hurrying.
"A blessing for your journey," he said, but then added quietly, "and my thanks for your discretion. Some truths serve better as mysteries." The coach lurched into motion, and the engineer watched his unlikely friends grow smaller with distance. Miguel waved until they rounded the bend, and the engineer knew the boy would make a fine engineer someday, not just of fountains, but of the delicate mechanisms that let societies function despite their contradictions. The journey to Porto took 2 days, with an overnight stop at Coimbra. The engineer used the travel time to write in his own journal, documenting the technical aspects of the fountain network for future engineers who might need to maintain or modify the system. But between the lines of hydraulic calculations and acoustic formulas, he found himself writing about other things, about Tomas's devotion to a lost cause, Senora Isabel's hunger for forbidden knowledge, Miguel's transformation from superstitious boy to rational apprentice. Porto greeted him with its familiar bustle of commerce and construction. The city was building new bridges, modernizing its port facilities, embracing the industrial age with enthusiasm. His new commission involved designing a water distribution system for a textile factory, practical work without mystery or history, which suited his mood perfectly. Yet as he stood in his new lodgings that first evening, looking out at the Douro River flowing toward the Atlantic, he found himself thinking of Neptune's fountain. At this hour, as shadows lengthened across Sintra's gardens, the fountains would be starting their evening concert. Tourists would gather, marvel at the acoustic engineering, take the waters at the nearby thermal baths, never knowing they stood where conspirators once listened for coded signals of revolution. His landlady, a practical widow named Senora Costa, brought him supper and noticed his contemplative mood. "You've come from Sintra, I heard. They say the fountains there sing like angels now." "Like angels who've forgotten what they're singing about," the engineer replied, then apologized for his cryptic response. But later, alone with his technical drawings and plans, he reconsidered his words. Perhaps forgetting was wrong. The fountains hadn't forgotten. They'd been translated. Their language shifted from revolution to beauty, from conspiracy to harmony. They still carried memory in their bronze chambers and water channels, but memory transformed into something the present could bear. He thought of Maria, whose absence had driven him to accept the Sintra Commission in the first place. 3 years of grief had taught him that memory, like water, had to keep flowing, or it became stagnant, poisonous. The work at Quinta da Sereia had helped him understand that the dead's dreams don't die, they transform, flowing into new channels, taking shapes their dreamers never imagined. A letter arrived within the week from Miguel, excited and slightly anxious. The fountains had performed their first full coordination, all 5 singing in harmony for the Feast of Saint Martin. The governor himself had attended, declaring it a triumph of Portuguese engineering. Miguel had been asked to explain the technical aspects to distinguished visitors, and, though nervous, he'd managed well. "Senora Isabel helped me prepare,"
the boy wrote. "She understands the mathematics better than engineers twice her age. Dom Afonso has even agreed to let her officially assist with the fountain's maintenance, though we call it household management to avoid scandal." The engineer smiled at this small revolution. A woman openly engaging in technical work, even if disguised as domestic duty. Perhaps the fountain's transformation from revolutionary tools to tourist attractions wasn't the only change worth noting. Society itself was shifting, slowly, as water wearing down stone, but inevitably forward. His work in Porto consumed him through the winter months, the practical challenges of industrial hydraulics a welcome contrast to Sintra's weighted history. Yet he kept a small bronze whistle on his desk, one of the original pieces from Neptune's fountain that he'd kept with Tomas's silent blessing. Sometimes, late at night, he would hold it to the gaslight, admiring Torelli's craftsmanship, remembering the old Italian master who'd built revolution into beauty. Spring brought unexpected news. The French government had officially pardoned all Patulea exiles, allowing them to return to Portugal if they wished. The engineer wondered if the young Conde, old now, if still alive, would come home to see his fountains singing their transformed songs. Would he recognize his dream in its new shape? Would he mourn what was lost or celebrate what survived? But those were questions without answers, like asking water why it flows downhill, or bronze why it resonates at certain frequencies. The engineer had learned that some mysteries were worth preserving, that not every question needed an answer, that sometimes the most honest thing was a carefully crafted lie that let people live with history's weight. As he returned to his drawings, planning Porto's industrial future with pipes and valves and pressure gauges, he thought one last time of Neptune's marble face, forever caught between triumph and sorrow. The god of waters had witnessed revolution become tourism, secrets become spectacle, dangerous dreams become safe memories. And perhaps, the engineer thought as he sketched new water channels for a new age, that transformation was its own kind of triumph. The victory not of any cause, but of life's endless ability to flow forward, finding new channels when old ones close, singing new songs when old ones are forbidden, always seeking its level in the endless journey from mountain to sea. The bronze whistle caught the lamplight, a small memorial to grander dreams, and the engineer returned to his work, building the future one pipe at a time, knowing that somewhere in Sintra's hills, water remembered how to sing, even if it had forgotten why.